Welcome to the afternoon session of the 2020 Budget Workshop for Public Libraries. This is Haley Treepin at the Indiana State Library. We are joined this afternoon by Todd Caldwell and Susan Gordon, Directors of Audit Services for the State Board of Accounts. And we are going to start with Todd. Todd, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. And thank you.
All right.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. Wanted to point out one thing. If you've already downloaded the presentation, your beginning slide may say May of 2020. When we did this the first time, I forgot to change months, apparently. I was a month behind with all the COVID stuff maybe, but anyway, the corrected version will be made available if you want to see it later. That's why it says, yours may say May, and now it says June. I want to thank the State Library for the opportunity to participate in this year's annual budget workshop. While our world is a bit different this spring, this webinar is not all that different to those that we've had in the past. Before, we've had most of you online with about a dozen or so in the room with us. But this year, we're 100% virtual. And the State Board of Accounts is doing many types of webinars and meetings in a virtual format. And we were already kind of headed that direction, and I think we're going full force with that now. Just even having meetings amongst ourselves because we're all working remotely. We're learning how to do that, and didn't realize there were all different types. There's Adobe Connect, there's WebEx, there's Zoom, there's all these things. Microsoft Teams is what we use internally, so there's all different kinds of various media that you can meet with, and I'm sure you're all aware of that, so I think we'll all be comfortable going forward with meeting in this way. I, however, am not that computer literate, so before I go any further, I wanted to thank my own personal IT guy, my son Ben. He helped me, always helps me get set up for these things, and I appreciate his help very much. He just finished his freshman year in high school, and he's hopeful to be back in the classroom in the fall as a sophomore. And while I'm mentioning family, I'll go ahead and cover them all just so I don't leave anybody out. My daughter Emma had her high school commencement on May the 31st. It was a virtual one. Our high school scheduled a virtual commencement during the period where more social controls were in place. Now that things are starting to relax a little bit, they went ahead with the virtual one, but they planned on having an in-person event on July the 12th, so the kids will get a chance to take part in the program where they get to walk across the stage and hear live speeches instead of recorded ones. And Emma will be a freshman at Butler in the fall. And then, of course, my wife puts up with me. We celebrated our 24th wedding anniversary yesterday. She works in the finance offices of Community Hospital in Anderson. She and I have been working from home since the first part of March, sharing internet bandwidth. Where I live on the outskirts of Pendleton, I don't have cable internet, and we've got it through Frontier home internet. It's not always that doesn't work out that well. Our bandwidth isn't that wide, reliable. I guess it's not all that much. So when you have all four of us here, we're constantly yelling back across the house saying, "Hey, can you log off? I've got a call to make." So currently, everyone in the house is offline, so I can do this presentation. For those of you that might be new in your positions, or you might not otherwise know me, my name, as Haley said, I'm Todd Caldwell, Director of Audit Services. I specialize and work with a few different types of governmental units, including libraries. I've been with the Board of Accounts almost 31 years, and I spent the last 5.5 or so in my current position after Charlie Pride retired. Joining me today is Susan Gordon. You're going to hear from Susan in a little bit. And so as you can see, our contact information is on the screen. If you didn't get a chance to jot that down right now, I know one of Susan's last slides will have it as well, so you can get it then. And as you might imagine, we're getting a lot of COVID-19 related questions from all different types of governmental units. And so we've been trying to answer those calls and emails first. That's slowed us down a little bit, so we thank you for your patience while we get caught back up. Here are some of the topics we're going to cover today. First, we'll discuss some coronavirus recent memos and directives from the State Board of Accounts and related policies. Since we'll be on the subject of policies, now is going to be a good time to cover some other policies that you should have. Next up will be a conversation about the chart of accounts. I know we trained on that last year and got a little update to go over today. Then I'll touch on appropriations and grants from an auditing perspective. And I'll wrap up the first half of today's discussion with a little new legislation that applies to the library. I'll turn the wheel over to Susan after that, and she'll cover some enhanced regulatory reporting items, as well as some information on remote auditing. And then she'll wrap up with a COVID-19 related item or two herself. The State Board of Accounts issued several memos back in March and April related to the coronavirus. We wanted to touch on those today. There were 3 that came out in March, and a total of 7 that came out in April, and 1 state examiner directive that would pertain to a library. If you haven't seen any or some of these, they're all on our website on our homepage at in.gov/SBOA. You scroll down a bit from the banners at the top of the page, you should see a section SBOA information on coronavirus, like you see in the picture. There are more items there on our web page than I could actually get in this screenshot. I just couldn't fit them all in, so if you go there, you will see more links. The third one from the bottom in the screenshot that you see there, dated May the 4th. From the time I captured that screenshot, there's been an update. It was on May the 28th. So if you click on that link today, it should take you to the May the 28th FAQs, and in fact, on our website, it'll say 5/28/20 instead of 5/4. The first 2 memos that we issued were on March the 12th and the 16th, which was right at the onset of the coronavirus in the United States, or at least when it started to hit home the most. It provided our audit position on situations surrounding the coronavirus and related accounting issues. The main takeaway from these memos are the library should develop and adopt a policy on how they're going to address coronavirus-related issues. The policies developed should have broad language that can reference more specific material so that the policy doesn't need to constantly be updated and improved. Circumstances, as you know, have been changing so fast that if you made your policy too specific and needed to make a change to it, then you'd have to amend and reapprove your policy. So make sure that your language is broad enough that you don't have to waste a lot of or spend a lot of time amending and reapproving. Speaking of approving, that needs to be approved in a public meeting if you haven't done that already. As you're probably aware, you can still have public meetings. The governor, in an executive order, loosened some of the requirements several weeks back on the open door law, and one of the things that was suspended was that on the virtual meeting or being in attendance, so it allowed you to have meetings without having a large gathering and practice social distancing. So we've urged libraries to work with their attorneys to develop a policy or policies specific to the public health emergency. The March the 12th memo had several items to take into consideration when adopting your policies, like remote working or paying employees who aren't able to work. The first thing to know is that our guidance is not meant to be considered restrictive. Library boards are going to need to monitor and address situations as quickly as possible because things are changing so quickly, and we don't want to restrict their actions or movements in any way. Finally, know that the Board of Accounts will not take out an exception to these policies and resulting responses that are due to the coronavirus. The March 31st memo was a result of inquiries from several units of government regarding using public funds to assist in some fashion local businesses or even citizens who have been negatively impacted by the coronavirus. Some of the funds we were asked about have specific statutory uses, which don't include easing someone's economic burden. We recognize that during the public health emergency, a broader reading of the statutory uses of public funds is permissible, and we won't take audit exception as long as Executive Order 20-02 and any amendments or clarifications are in effect. The governing body adopts a policy in a public meeting that approves these expenditures as an authorized use of public funds. There is a written legal opinion from an attorney that the expenditure has a legitimate government purpose and is acceptable under the Indiana Code. And if that expenditure is from a dedicated fund source like LRF or your capital projects fund, then the written legal opinion must determine that the particular fund used has a closer connection to the government purpose to be fulfilled than your operating fund would. Now, we had one city in southern Indiana excuse me, that wanted to use their food and beverage money to provide assistance to some of the restaurants and bars that had to close. And in that particular county, their food and beverage tax had a specific statutory use, and basically they had to use it for their convention center. So using it in this manner would not be related to that if they were going to give it to the bars and restaurants. So they reached out to us, and several others did as well, and so that's why we put this policy together. And finally, the policy needs to explain that the expenditure is needed to address the economic effects of the public health emergency. The April the 3rd memo deals with the continuity of operations and was developed to assist units with developing a plan to continue essential operations in the event that key personnel were not only unable to work at an office or even remotely, but also in the event that they should become totally incapacitated for an extended period of time. We know of one governmental unit where the fiscal officer became ill to the point of not being able to even work remotely. At that particular unit, the only other person in the office was unable to come in because of the fear that the entire office had been contaminated. So in this case, officials had to look at how to operate when the only person able to process transactions and write checks was not physically going to be able to do so for an undetermined period of time. The April 3rd memo recommends developing a plan for prolonged and substantial absenteeism by employees, including key business or accounting functions. There may be, as in the example I mentioned, an office where there's only one or two people involved in the accounting function. So what's going to happen if both of those people become sick? That's what a plan developed now will help with in the event the illness happens. Included in the plan designated who would take over and how. Work now with your banks in case the person on the checking account is the only one. So how are checks going to be issued? Have a central location for important contact information like the names of your library board members, your banking representatives, your accounting software vendors. Somebody may need to get in contact with them just in order to be able to post transactions to your computer. You might also include a list of neighboring libraries that might be able to assist during the absence, especially on the software part. If the neighboring library has the same system that you have, they may be able to help somebody who has to sit down and post stuff and helping them get through that software. Also, you might think about a list of items that can be postponed until after the public health emergency. For equipment, like what would be available to permit employees to work remotely. Take home laptops, monitors, printers, anything like that that would help them still do their job. To help in the development of your plan, and in addition to the items that we note in the memo, FEMA has a continuity resource kit on their website that we found to be very useful, and we recommend checking it out. The website is listed on the memo, or you can simply Google FEMA Continuity Resource Toolkit, and it'll take you right to that. The April the 9th memo was to remind libraries experiencing cash flow issues of the existing provisions for temporary transfers in Indiana Code 36-1-8-4, letter A. The statute requires a resolution for the temporary transfer of a prescribed amount for a prescribed period of time. That prescribed period of time has to end at least in the current budget year. That would be by 12/31. The prescribed period of time could be shorter than that, but most places that do a temporary transfer state that it'll be repaid by the end of the year. At the end of the year, if an emergency exists, then the library board can declare an emergency, and that payback period can be extended up to 6 months. If you had to do a transfer now, in theory, you could have until June of next year to pay that back if your board would declare an emergency at that. The April the 14th memo is regarding electronic signatures. If libraries continue their essential operations during the public health emergency, they may find it useful to adjust their signature process to an electronic one as opposed to handwritten signatures. Our position is electronic signatures are generally controlled by Indiana Code 2628. And you'll need to have adequate internal controls in place to ensure that the signature is created by the person whose name is going to appear, or internal controls for the person who has the legal authority to sign a document on an official's behalf. So, for example, if Susan and I were in an office library setting and she was my superior, but she delegated the authority for me to sign certain documents, that would need to be in part of your controls and show up that way when you did the electronic signature. So we won't take audit exception, meaning we won't write a comment in your audit reports if you use electronic signatures, provided that the signature and the corresponding procedures comply with the relevant parameters set out in the Indiana Code. The next memo was the April 20th one, and it was on CARES provider relief. And when this money came out, or the reason for this memo was the money had just started coming out as part of the CARES Act. And the first group of money that started hitting the local units, we don't believe applied to libraries. There are several different CARES monies being provided, and the one that seemed to hit first only related to those entities like a city or town that's providing Medicare fee-for-service reimbursements in the year 2019. So a city, for example, might provide ambulance service, and they bill Medicare for that. They were the first group to start getting some of the CARES money. So the 420 memo kind of applied to that and how to handle that, and it probably won't apply to a library. And on April 23rd, that document was not so much a memo, but rather a link to guidance provided by the federal government for relief funds. On April 27th, we issued a memo regarding enhanced regulatory financial statement reporting. And we've mentioned that in previous trainings that changes were coming along for this year. And Susan's going to discuss later what's happening with those going forward. As the grant money started arriving at the various local governmental units, we started getting a lot of questions about how to count for them and how to handle appropriations. The memo dated April 29th provided guidance on what to do. The first question many units had was if the grant or grants had to be kept in or accounted for in separate funds. And if yes, what fund number should they use? The answer is yes. Any specific COVID money that you receive needs to be accounted for in a separate fund. For libraries, they can use any number available in your system within the series 276 to 299. For each grant, it's important that you track every dollar dispersed for COVID-related expenses and maintain supporting documentation for those expenses. This provides accountability and transparency for these grants. If you were to put these monies in an existing fund or commingle them in other funds, it becomes impossible to determine that the monies are being used as provided for in the grant agreements. And we learned in the May the 28th frequently asked questions update that I mentioned earlier that COVID money is considered federal assistance and it's going to be subject to the single audit and related provisions of uniform guidance. So for your reporting purposes on your next annual financial reports, any CARES Money Act that you get will have a CFDA number of 21.019. 21.019. It's important to remember that sufficient internal controls over all transactions must be in place. Separate funds, maintaining records, detailed comments that provide audit trails, appropriate approvals, etc., are all part of good internal controls. Based on the statutory provisions in Indiana Code 10-14-3, which state that a political subdivision may waive procedures and formalities otherwise required by law pertaining to the appropriation and expenditure of public funds, where a natural disaster or security emergency has been declared. The Board of Accounts will not take audit exception to the expense being paid directly out of the COVID grant fund without appropriation or additional appropriation prior to spending the money in the COVID grant fund. So basically, you don't need an appropriation. Put COVID monies in separate funds, and our audit position is you can spend them without appropriation. Next up was the State Examiner Directive 2020-1, and it provided our audit position on two specific items. First was the depositing of money. We recognize that some library offices weren't going to be open to the public. Maybe they wouldn't even be open every day, so we're not going to take audit exception to limiting the frequency of your deposits to twice a week instead of every day. So on days when you're not depositing, you want to ensure that the money is secure. Is it in a safe, a locked area, a locked desk, or a cabinet? And don't forget, you still need to consider internal controls during the entire public health emergency period. So there are controls over depositing. You need to take those into consideration. And that still, you've got the threshold of $500 before you have to deposit. And so this may not be an issue for many libraries. It may take you several days before you even get to $500. Just know that we aren't taking exception if you only went to the bank twice a week during the public health emergency. Maybe you're a large library and you get all kinds of money coming in every day. You wouldn't even necessarily have to go to the bank. And on the approval of claims, we recognize that claims still need to be paid and you might not be having many meetings. We've heard of units that have totally shut down all operations. The bills continue to come in. We understand that, and we won't take audit exception to the board designating a member, one of their members, to be the quote-unquote approver. This person can approve claims in the interim during the public health emergency, so checks can be written prior to approval. And after the health emergency is over, or when you start having full open meetings with the entire board present, those checks written during the crisis can be approved. Or your board can provide written approval to your fiscal officer, to your treasurer, to pay certain claims in advance of approval. You already have that statutory authority where you have a resolution of these things can be paid in advance. Now, during the health emergency, if you want to provide a list instead of just everything that your board can, or that your fiscal officer can pay prior to board approval, that would be okay. We won't take exception to that. Again, any payments that are made during that period under that provision would be approved at the next regular board meeting. So I've discussed the need for written policies related to COVID-19. So while we're on the policies subject, now would be a good time to look at some other policies that you might want to have in place. And keep in mind that during an audit, we're going to audit to what your policy is in place at the time. The first one is a bad debt or a write-off policy. Unfortunately, you may from time to time have instances where someone owes the library money. Late fees and other items might be owed, and sometimes a portion of those fees might not get collected. So from time to time, you might have to write off those uncollectible ones as bad debt. In order to do so in a consistent manner, the board needs to have a written policy concerning a procedure for writing off of bad debts or uncollectible accounts or any adjustments to account balances. The policy must specify how long an account is delinquent before writing it off. Also an amount. Is there a threshold of, everything under $10 we're going to write off at a certain time? Everything else we're going to try to collect, whatever your threshold would be. And any other special circumstances, like making adjustments that might arise. If you've got someone that owes some fees or fines, not able to pay, you want to make an adjustment or give them more time, those are all things that you want to have in your policy. Documentation needs to exist for all efforts made by library officials to collect any amounts that are owed prior to the write-offs. If you wanted to learn more or see a little more information about bad debts, the library's manual, our library's manual in Chapter 1, also has information on the necessity for a bad debts policy. Credit cards and debit cards. You need to have a policy for both if you want to use either. So if you want to use both a debit card and a credit card, you need to have two separate policies. Either policy that you have needs to be adopted by the board through a resolution. And what the cards can be used for should be specifically stated in the resolution. Each type of card should be held by a designated employee, as opposed to issuing cards to employees who carry them around like they would their personal cards. Use of both should not bypass the claims process. We've seen some libraries that use that card almost exclusively rather than acquiring and paying for things through the claims process. Receipts are required to support the charges on any credit card statement, or in the case of a debit card, on your bank statement. They should be originals, and the policy should include that. The originals are required. In the case where you get those heat printed receipts, or the ones that tend to fade away over time, we'd recommend photocopying or scanning the original as soon as you get it and attach the original and the photocopy to the claim. That way in a couple of years when we come in to do an audit, if the one is faded, if the original one can't be read anymore, we can see that the photocopy is attached and know that that was what that was. Know that that is what that receipt was for. Otherwise, you've got a blank piece of paper that doesn't really do anybody any good, several years later when you're trying to audit that. You should all have a travel policy in place. Some items it could contain for your consideration are, like, when is a library official really traveling? Is it when they drive to the bank to make a deposit? Is it when they drive to the local hardware store to maybe get a small part or a supply? Is it only when they travel outside the library territory? That's what your policy should define as to what is considered travel status, or when is the employee traveling. The policy needs to make it clear or in what instances an employee is traveling and might be eligible for reimbursement of certain expenses. Also, does the travel need to be approved, either by the director or the board? But those are decisions to be made locally and included in your policy. An employee may think it's necessary to attend a conference, let's say in Las Vegas or Orlando. The prior approvals needed in order to attend should be addressed. Like maybe the library director doesn't think someone needs to go to a conference in Vegas. And we've seen those happen when the policies don't consider that, and it can create some conflict locally and some issues audit-wise when we come in to look. So If someone's travel needs to be approved, that needs to be stated. You need to make that clear. You can reimburse an employee for traveling in their personal car at a set rate per mile that the board establishes. The rate could be the federal rate. We've seen some libraries use the rate that state employees are reimbursed at, or it can be any other rate. What we would recommend is, if you're going to go that route, putting the words federal rate or the word state rate in your policy so that you don't have to amend it each time those rates change. For example, the state employee reimbursement rate right now is 39 cents, I believe. If you were just to put 39 cents in your travel policy and the state's rate changed and went up to 42 cents, let's say, you would still have to pay what was stated in your ordinance if you said 39 or 38 cents. So just saying whatever the state employee's rate is or the federal rate is at the time just keeps you from having to amend your policy every time those rates change. You also want to consider defining your boundaries for the purpose of reimbursing travel expenses like meals and lodging. Does it have to be within a 50-mile radius of the library? Does it have to be outside of the county or outside the library territory? As far as lodging goes, you might want to consider having your policy state how and where an employee traveling can stay. Is there a limit? Like state employees have a limit. In certain parts of the state, we can't stay in a room that's more than $98 a night. Your policy should consider, does it always have to be at the hotel if they're going to a conference? As opposed to maybe staying across the street at a hotel that's maybe cheaper than where the conference is actually being held. What can be included when you're staying overnight? Hotel expenses like valet parking, or no, you're not going to reimburse for that. In-house movies, in-room movies. I have on my sheet minibar. I don't know how many hotels have minibars anymore, but back in the day, it wasn't uncommon to open that little refrigerator and be full of $7 Snickers bars or something like that. So if you don't want to reimburse for those things, make that clear in your policy. And then meals. How are you going to pay for meals? Are you going to give them a limit of how much they can spend a day? Are you going to require actual receipts to be turned in? Or different amounts for different meals? For example, state employees, we get reimbursed a certain amount for breakfast, a certain amount for lunch, and a different amount for dinner meals. And state employees have to be in travel status overnight. So if I go to a conference in southern Indiana, drive in the morning, drive back home, I don't get reimbursed for any of my meals or any of that paid unless I spend the night. And along with the public health emergency, a lot of conferences and travel had to be canceled. So your policy should have provisions in it for cancellations and who would be responsible. For example, if an employee is supposed to be traveling and has to cancel due to their own circumstances, do they have to reimburse like airfare or conference fees? What if the employee has a death in the family and has to cancel? Are you going to hold them responsible or not? And how would expenses be handled when the cancellation is beyond the employee's control, like a pandemic situation? None of our faults that happened, but we do know that there were fees and cancellations involved due to the coronavirus. For employees traveling in their own cars, to get reimbursed, they need to complete the prescribed General Form 101. Travel in cars should not be reimbursed using the regular claim or accounts payable voucher. Filling out this form should be specific from location to location. For example, traveling from Pendleton to Indianapolis wouldn't be very specific because it would depend on where in Indianapolis a person was going. And also keep in mind that commuting mileage is not reimbursable. You also need to have a policy on leave and overtime. When will it be earned and how? The library's manual in Chapter 1 has the paragraph that you see on the screen that each unit needs to adopt a written policy regarding the accrual and use of leave time and compensatory time and the payment of overtime. Negotiated labor contracts approved by the governing body would be considered as written policy for those places that have those. And the policy has got to conform to the requirements of all state and federal regulatory agencies. Also, Indiana Code 5-10-6-1 requires leave benefits be in an ordinance. Libraries have resolutions. Doesn't address that in the statute, but of course, resolution would be okay from an audit perspective. With leaves and overtime work, the prescribed forms are still required. That's General Form number 99A, titled the Employee Service Record. It's prescribed to maintain at each library. It can be used as documentation in order to properly prepare General Form 99, which is the payroll voucher. And 99A, the service record records the hours or days worked, sick leave taken, vacation leave taken, or days lost. It may also be used to comply with the requirements of 511.9.4 regarding recording hours worked each day by an employee. We'd recommend, if you have any questions about labor, overtime, etc., the authority in that area is the Indiana Department of Labor. You have their contact information there. You can call that number and select option 3, or you can email wagehour@dol.in.gov. I'll touch on just a few more policies that you want to consider. Alcohol. I know a lot of people think, wow, we can never buy alcohol. Well, that isn't exactly true. From our perspective, you need to have a policy on alcohol purchases. If you're never going to have them, you can state that in your policy. If you're going to allow that to happen, you need to have that clear in your policy when it would be. If an employee is traveling, can they have an alcoholic beverage? Are you going to have maybe a fundraiser or something at the library of an evening, and maybe it's a real fancy deal and you're giving out champagne? Those are things you'll want to consider. Also, investments, capital assets, small purchases, and the slide should say personal property. Kick property over to the next line, but personal property, if you're going to have or allow your employees to use library assets for their personal use from time to time, have a policy on that. For example, Board of Accounts has a policy that says I can use my laptop, my state-issued laptop, for personal uses from time to time. You know, like if I want to check out what's going on in the world, I can go to some media outlet, their website, or check other things, but that's all included in your policy.
Hey, Todd, we have a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
Where do I find the library manual you're talking about?
The library manual is the Accounting and Uniform Guidelines manual for Indiana libraries, and it's on our website. So in.gov/SBOA. When you get there, on the left-hand side, you'll see a link that says, or a drop-down that says political subdivisions. When you click on that, it'll drop down all the different types of political subdivisions that we audit. And so you scroll down a little bit, you'll see libraries. Click on libraries, and that'll take you to a page that's devoted to everything libraries and Board of Accounts connected. Once you're to that page, you'll scroll down a ways and you will see a subsection for manuals. And there's a drop down, a little triangle, upside down triangle that you can click on that gives you a drop down, and then you will see manuals. And it'll have the library manual, and it lists each chapter individually. So you can click on each chapter at a time to go through it, but that's where the manual is. I mentioned chapter 1 earlier, so you can see chapter 1 of the library manual by clicking on that one.
And we have another question. If we can pull the leave information out of our database, is it correct that we do not have to fill out the actual forms?
Yes. The forms that I talked about are the prescribed forms. You can use an alternate form a lot of accounting systems, computerized systems, will have their own forms. They may not be in the same exact format or order as our prescribed forms, but as long as your system generates a report that has the same information, that's okay. Maybe it even has the same information on 2 different reports. That would be okay too. Yeah, if you've entered that into your system, you can keep it in your system. You can print out reports if you want. You don't have to. It's just that when we come to do an audit, we're going to want to see that. If you're not printing them out, we're going to want to see it electronically. And we have had occasion that where we've gone to do that, and for some reason the file has gone bad for some reason. It's been infected or it's been damaged in some way, and we can't get to that information. So that creates a problem. If you're planning on keeping electronic information for us to look at, you need to make sure that your backups are working. So you need to test them occasionally and ensure that the information is there, that you can get to it at any time just by testing, some of those reports and looking to see, or helping to ensure that a file doesn't go bad. And I see there's a couple other questions.
Yep. Can you get a COVID grant to cover the extra costs not in budget of safety items, gloves, sanitizers, floor signs, plexiglass for desks, etc.?
There are part of the CARES Act. Some of those different distributions of money do cover things like you're mentioning, the extra costs for safety items and gloves and sanitizers. You can get grants like that. They are available. I would contact, if you had questions about how to go about getting that, either a federal agency like Health and Human Services is where most of the CARES money is coming from. There may be other agencies that are having that, or you could get with, you might try the Indiana Finance Authority. It's our understanding that most of the CARES money that's coming in comes to the Indiana Finance Authority first, and then they distribute it out. You might check with the Indiana Finance Authority as far as what you have to do if you wanted to try to get some COVID money and apply for. There are some that you don't have to apply for. There are some of those CARES, the money just shows up and it's based on certain parameters that already exist, and so you don't have to do anything. There may be others out there where you might have to actually ask for it. And that's where I would start with either the federal agency or the finance authority.
Is there an online version of the claim?
There is not an online version of the mileage claim. Trying to remember, one of the manuals doesn't even have the illustration in it, and it might be the library manual. Don't remember. But we can send you a copy that we have. I think going forward, as we're updating the manuals and making that information available on our website, that we need to have an illustration of all the forms that are out there so you can at least see what they look like, because you can create an exact replica of one of our forms using Excel, for example. So if you saw what that mileage claim looked like and you think, hey, I don't want to pay for that from a public printer and have the hard copy, if I could create something on a spreadsheet, you could certainly do that, but you'd have to see what it looked like. Be able to easily see what it looked like in order to do so.
What happens if I have more than one gift fund or construction fund on the chart of accounts?
If you have more than one, then one of them needs to be the number that's on the chart of accounts. So you can see on your screen, Fund 200 is a gift fund. So if you had 7 gift funds, one of them would be Fund 200, and then the other 6 would then fall into you can't see it because of where I have the red circle, but there's a series of other special revenue funds in this case, which goes from 226 to 275. Again, you can't see that because of the red circle, I think, but that's what it says. To illustrate it a little better, if you go down about to the middle of the picture there that I've taken, it says capital projects, and then off to the right of that, it says construction fund 401. If you had another construction fund, you can make it in the series 403 to 410 that says reserved for other capital project funds. So your second construction fund would be 403, and you would have one as 401.
If you do a reimbursement under the CARES Act from your city, would you just deposit those funds in the general fund?
If your city is giving you CARES Act money, no, that would be accounted for in a separate fund. So if you've spent money out of your general fund or your operating fund and you're getting reimbursed for those expenses, technically what you should do is move those expenses out of your operating fund down to your grant fund. That'll help account for that. And then when you get reimbursed for all of that amount, at the end of the day, your grant fund would have a zero balance if you get reimbursed for all of your expenses. So let's talk about the chart of accounts. As I mentioned, we talked about it last fall a little bit when we created that. And that was because we're finding that libraries and other types of governmental units were all over the place on what their fund numbers were, and it was just not possible for comparability to see what one unit of government was using or doing compared to another unit. So you can compare library to library because somebody else might have called their gift fund Fund 1000 or Fund 20 instead of the same thing. So we're getting everybody back on the same page. We issued this chart in the training and also in the December bulletin. As I discussed earlier, any COVID grants are going to be in the separate fund in the series 276 to 299. That part you can see on the screen. We did make some changes to it. We added the term local grants to the terminology. Before it was just federal and state. So when you look at the December bulletin, you're not going to see that word. But now it's federal, state, and local grants are funds 276 to 299. There, local grants 276 to 299. And we changed that to add the word local. And as I mentioned, it's in the December 19 library bulletin on page 2. Well, since this is a budget workshop, we would obviously want to address some budget-related items. I know DLGF spoke earlier, and you probably heard great information from them. From an audit perspective, as far as appropriations go, the first thing to keep in mind is that we're going to look to see that expenditures don't exceed appropriations. And in the statute that you see that we've included for your reference, where it says proper officers, those are going to be your library boards. They're the ones that would set the expenditures and set the budget amount for the year. We get some questions about what does that mean, proper officers. It's going to be your governing body, your library boards. So the statute required expenditures are not to exceed appropriations, but you need to have an appropriation before you even write that check. So sometimes you might run a little short and you might have to get an additional appropriation. So if you've got questions about that entire process, you'll need to contact DLGF. Also, we know that DLGF came out with a memo dated April the 24th, 2020, discussing the additional appropriation process in light of COVID-19. So please look at that document on the DLGF website or contact your field representative, your DLGF field representatives. I know they'll have more information on that as well. Some appropriations are required to be done through DLGF, and some are required to be done locally. There are times when an appropriation is not required. What you're seeing here is not an exhaustive list, but some of the most common times when an appropriation isn't required. We just wanted to provide this to you for your future reference. And remember, unless a statute provides otherwise, Appropriations required for the expenditure of funds. And if you've got questions, certainly you can contact us or your library attorney or the Department of Local Government Finance. There we go. You may find that you need to transfer from one major budget classification to another. For example, you've overestimated the amount needed for supplies and you need to move that to capital outlay. That's not a problem as long as that transfer is not going to require the expenditure of more money than the total amount set out in the budget. So you do need to follow the procedures that are set out in Indiana Code 6-1.1-18-6. Many of you are familiar with this statute. If you get money from an insurance company or a person as a result of damage to the property, then the fiscal officer can go ahead and add that amount to a line item appropriation if the money is going to be used to repair or replace the damaged property and funds are expended within 12 months after being received. So if someone throws a brick through the window and they end up paying for it, or the insurance company pays you for it, rather than go through an additional appropriation process, you can take that amount of money that's paid to you and add it to your line item that you would have paid for that repair out of. Let's say you had a line item called repairs. You would add that to the appropriation for repairs. And if you're going to spend it within 12 months, you don't have to do anything else other than write the check when the property has been repaired. And that way it doesn't affect your current year appropriation. Let's talk about appropriations for advance grants. A grant is considered an advance grant when the money is given to the library up front in order to pay for allowable expenses related to a certain program. Advance grants should be put into a separate fund and no appropriation is required.
There's a question in the chat. What was the date of the additional appropriations bulletin due to COVID?
Thank you. I didn't see the question come in. It was April the 24th, I believe. Let me look through my notes. Yes, April 24th, 2020. If you go to DLGF's website and you don't find it, they have a search feature like most websites do in the upper right-hand corner. And if you just maybe type in that date, April 24, or additional appropriation, and it'll give you all the hits for those. You should find it pretty quickly. A reimbursement grant requires the unit to expend money up front for allowable expenses under a specific program and then send a request to the grantor to be reimbursed for allowable expenses under the program. Indiana Code 6-1.1-18-7.5 provides where a federal or a state grant provides for payments to be made directly to the library on a reimbursement basis after payment of expenses by the library, then the entire amount of the federal or state reimbursement may be appropriated by the library board without using the additional appropriations statutory procedures if the funds are provided or designated by the state or the federal government as a reimbursement. So if you look at that statute, it says just that if you get a reimbursement grant, you've spent the money, you get a reimbursement, you can add that back in locally with approval of your board. You don't have to go through the hearing and the advertising and the additional appropriation process, although I do believe DLGF wants to be notified when you do that. So you might check with them on that just to be sure that you're following their compliance requirements. And we're not sure how prevalent it might be, but we do understand there may be some COVID money available for libraries. As I discussed earlier, you'll want to read the memo from April the 29th. Each separately identified assistance that you receive should be accounted for in a separate fund. Whether it's an advance grant or a reimbursement grant, it needs to be in a separate fund. You're going to want to be able to track every dollar spent. Make sure that money is spent only for the purposes stated in the grant, and make sure that you have sufficient supporting documentation for each disbursement. It's recommended that all related expenditure records like accounts payable vouchers, board minutes, correspondence, emails, contracts, those all be kept in a separate file for future audits by either the Board of Accounts or a federal or state agency. And as always, as you always hear us say, you're going to want to establish internal controls to make sure that all this is done properly. That April 29th memo discussed appropriations as well. All right, I'll wrap up my last couple of minutes talking about some new legislation. House Bill 1113, excuse me, Public Law 159, contained provisions to align the deadline for your board to adopt a budget within the general deadline of November 1. And effective in July, any post-employment benefits now get reported to the Board of Accounts. You no longer have to report those to DLGF. It's still going to be done in Gateway. It'll just be through the Board of Accounts side of Gateway. Excuse me. On the Senate side, Senate Rollback 410 made some changes to the review of budgets of certain libraries. It added the word territory for determining when to report to a city or town fiscal body if the library is entirely in the city or town limits, or if not entirely, but more than 50% is in a city or town. It also added requirements for reporting proposed budgets to a county fiscal body when applicable. So it added the terminology or the wording, or the public library's territory covers more than one county. Also establishes procedures for libraries to identify the applicable city, town, or county fiscal body to get the library's proposed budget. So before October 1 of this year, a public library is to report the applicable city, town, or county fiscal body to the Indiana State Library. A little more on Senate Rollback 410. It defines a public library as a qualified entity under IC 10-13-316, which is the chapter on criminal history information. It requires the library to adopt a policy regarding conducting background checks of current employees, current volunteers, prospective employees, and prospective volunteers, all of whom would be 18 years or older. Finally, Senate Rollback 410 provides that a library board may issue a library card without a fee or a reduced fee to someone who is not a resident of the district and who is a child receiving foster care services. So in conclusion of my portion, before I turn it over to Susan, I had a slide with some references that you might find useful. For example, the governor's executive orders. You can click on that link or go there, copy that, paste it in your browser to see the executive orders. Our coronavirus information is at in.gov/SBOA, like I mentioned. There's also a link there to the governor's orders. The Finance Authority has information on the coronavirus at in.gov/IFA. Somebody asked earlier about the library's manual. Where can that be found? You can go to SBOA, political subdivisions, libraries, and then find manuals. For the Indiana Code citations, the image just kind of covered that up a little bit, I think, but it's iga.in.gov. You want to look for that little box, and you can type in your title, article, chapter, or section numbers if you know them, or if you're not sure, you can type some keywords in there that'll help you find what you're looking for. I don't see any other comments or questions that have come in, so thank you everybody for listening to me for the last exactly hour. It just clicked over to 3 o'clock, and with that, Susan, I will turn it over to you.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to my home out here in the Brownsburg Library District. It's nice to see everything opening up and getting to see people again and go to the library. It's just it's a beautiful day today, so very thankful for that. Well, things have certainly changed a lot, haven't they, in the last 3 months or so. It does kind of seem like we've all had a world turned upside down in one way or another, and learning how to make changes to keep each other safe and still do everything we need. And we're going to continue our discussion of those changes in this section as it relates to your operations. Now, if you're like me, you had to make a lot of changes at home too. I now work remotely from home 100% of the time, which I really like, and it's going very well. For my family members, my college student is having to get used to online classes, which he says are a little hard to pay attention to, so I've tried to keep that in mind today. My daughter is a nurse, and she works with COVID patients all the time, and she's been doing well, been kept safe from the virus on that. She, unfortunately for her, she has to completely sanitize herself before she even comes into our house at the end of the day, but she is one of those, heroes of the pandemic. My oldest daughter, who doesn't live with us anymore, she's got a family of her own. I had to get used to the idea of visiting my granddaughter by video chat. I have to be honest, I'd never ever video chatted with anybody on my phone before. I'm not even sure I realized it was a feature until the pandemic, and that has been a great tool for us to keep in contact during this time. And finally, my 16-year-old, when school was let out early, she has a little extra time on her hands to do some things she really likes to do, and she enjoys taking pictures. So I have scattered a few of those throughout the slides for you today, so that you have something nice to look at. Now, like Todd, much of my presentation is centered around COVID-19, just because that's where we've been and where we're coming out of, and all the changes that we've had to deal with because of it. So the first thing that I would like to talk to you about is the enhanced regulatory basis of accounting. Now, last year we spent a lot of time talking about updates to the regulatory basis of accounting. You remember that we were updating our regulatory basis in 2 phases, and the purpose for that was to move in the direction of providing information that's being required more and more by our financial statement users. And a good example of one of those users would be a bond rating company. Well, we rolled out the changes for 2019, and you all did a great job of gathering this information for the 2019 AFR, and we'll take a look at that here in just a minute. I'm sure that many of you have seen a memo stating that the 2019 audits will continue with the 2018 basis of accounting, 2018 regulatory basis of accounting. Now, our main reason for this was just to allow all of us to work efficiently through this public health emergency and not to complicate the situation any further. The delay of the implementation of the 2019 changes will reduce the number of document requests that we have for you during the audit, and we hope that this will just help in this time of social distancing and remote work. So we'll just have a brief review before we head on into the rest of the presentation on that. Now, for the 2019 AFR, you uploaded information to prepare the notes to the financial statements for long-term debt, leases, interfund transfers, pensions, OPEB, and capital assets. And that was a major accomplishment, and we truly do appreciate you working so diligently to pull all of that information together. There were not too many legislative changes for libraries this session, as you could tell from Todd's presentation, but the one that you'll all be applauding is the one that you don't have to give OPEB information to both the LGF and the State Board of Accounts. You'll just be presenting that on the annual financial report. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, we'll not be including these notes in the 2019 notes to the financial statements. However, this information is still important to future audits and the future anticipated change to the regulatory basis of accounting. So please keep maintaining all of that information for your records. It will still be required on the next annual financial report. Now, last year we did not spend a lot of time on this one, but we did mention that more changes were coming in 2020, and here's a list of those changes for your reference. Again, in light of the issues caused by COVID-19, we are postponing the 2020 changes. This information will not be required on the next AFR. In fact, I know you'll be applauding again. We do not anticipate any major changes to the AFR for next year. So because all of this, what we want to do this year is address some trouble spots on the 2019 AFR, and the main one is probably going to be capital assets. Now, the accounting for capital assets is a tall order, and many are still struggling to put this together. It has been complicated by COVID-19 in that your consultants or maybe even your own employees cannot come in and do the work they need to do to provide all of the information necessary for your ledger, and as a result, the schedule. Well, again, due to COVID-19, this information will not be included in the notes to the financial statements for 2020, but it will remain as an unaudited supplementary schedule in your report. So what this means for you is that to the extent possible under COVID-19, you should still continue to gather the information for the capital asset schedule and maintain the capital asset ledger. You know, this has always been a requirement. For audit purposes, have your capitalization threshold document and your ledger available for our field examiners. They're going to want to look at your internal controls also and see that you have procedures in place for recording additions of capital assets and disposal of capital assets. We are putting the calculation of accumulated depreciation on hold for now, but keep in mind that the enhanced regulatory changes for 2020 are just postponed. You still do need to go ahead and assign an estimated useful life to an asset when it is added to the ledger so that depreciation can be easily calculated when the time comes. But we are not asking you to calculate accumulated depreciation at this time. Just in case you're new or you've not heard our training on capital assets, here are some resources you may want to check out just at your own convenience. Of course, please feel free to call us or email us and ask us questions if you're having trouble in this area.
A question
Now, the next
in the chat. She's asking, where can we find the estimated useful life of assets? Is there a chart?
There is not a chart that the State Board of Accounts provides, and we can't provide that because it would be making a management decision for you on that. So you might want to consult. There's different internet sources. An example of one would be the gfoa.org, which is the Government Finance Officers Association. They have some information on that, and there are a lot of other internet sites that would have suggested estimated useful lives. Okay, the next topic I have is how to prepare for a remote audit. The one thing we've all learned from COVID-19 is the importance of using technology to communicate and transmit information. And to do that, we have to make use of that technology and have our information in a format that can be transmitted. Fortunately, Board of Accounts already had technology and procedures in place to do remote auditing. If you remember, that was the primary reason behind the monthly and annual uploads that we started a couple of years ago. Some of you may have experienced a remote audit. We have found that it works very well. Due to COVID-19, our auditors are all working remotely 99% of the time now, and that means they're working from their homes. The main communication you're going to receive from our field examiners will be by email or phone, and that includes entrance and exit conferences. If you do get an email and you're not sure that it's from one of our field examiners, please feel free to contact us and we will confirm that for you. We do have other technology available, such as Microsoft Teams and WebEx, which allows us to hold video conferences as necessary. and the state examiner is very interested in having our field examiners conduct their conferences through one of these methods. So please don't hesitate at all to ask for a video conference. Our field examiners will be happy to do that, and they should be communicating with you regularly throughout the week. And when our auditors first make contact with you via email or phone, please discuss what your COVID-19 protocol is. We all want to be very respectful of the procedures you have put in place at your library as we go through the audit. Now, in order to be as efficient as possible, you will be receiving documents from our office that you'll be requested to complete. And those will have to do with your financial statements that have been generated from Gateway. You'll be asked to confirm that those are correct. Also, you will be asked to fill out information about your internal controls. Having all of these forms completed ahead of time will help your audit go more smoothly. So when you get these, please go ahead and take care of that at that time. You may get these weeks or even months before the auditors actually arrive. So just go ahead and take care of those at the time, again, to make things go smoothly. We do have a YouTube video that's available on our website for you to look at. It's called Forms Prior to Audit, and there are actually 4 forms that you'll be sent. If you'd like to take a look at that, that might help you when you get those. As far as the supporting documentation and the documents we'll be requesting during the audit are concerned, we will ask that you scan and upload most of the supporting documentation that we will need for your audit. These requests will come through a Gateway Direct Request email, and it will show up as a no-reply email from our field examiners through Gateway. It will contain a list of documents that are needed and where you can upload those into Gateway, and that's going to be in the monthly and annual upload application. Remember that application is not a public site. That is only for our field examiners to use for audit purposes. So when you're uploading your documents, they will not be going to the public site. They're going to be going to our field examiners. It is preferred that we use this Gateway Direct Request feature rather than emailing your records, because the Direct Request feature is much more secure. It is secure. If there is any time where the document request that you get is too large, whether that's in size or quantity, please feel free to discuss this with your field examiner and find a solution to that. For example, one solution might be you go ahead and pull the documents and put them in a separate room, and our auditor can arrive within the next couple of days to review those on site, or possibly go ahead and scan those in and review those at another location. Review the scans at another location. And one thing that we do ask as well is that you please acknowledge the requests as soon as you receive them. This is not to say that you have to jump on it right then and provide all of the documents that day. What our field examiners like to know is that, first of all, you did receive it, and second of all, that you will work on it, and what your estimated time frame is for getting that information back to them. The procedures that we have now in place, our field examiners are given a number of audits to work on at the same time. So they can set yours aside for a little while and work on a different one while they're waiting on records. But it does help them to plan if they know when you think you're going to have those finished. So if you could just keep that communication going as to when you think you'll have information available, that would be very helpful. State Examiner 2018-1 requires certain documents to be uploaded monthly and annually. I'm sure you're all aware of this. And please make sure that you're continuing this. It will help in the future to have many of the documents needed for audit ahead of time. If by chance your auditor requests a document that you've already uploaded, please discuss this with them and find out what the issue might be. It could be that they've looked at it, but they need more information, or maybe the document didn't scan clearly, or maybe it's not in a format that they can use. So please talk to them and try and work out a solution for what could be usable or if they need additional information. I do know that when you're uploading this information, they prefer Excel documents. Now, while we're conducting our audits remotely, if our field examiners do have to come to your office, it will only be by express permission of their supervisor for a very particular reason. Our field examiners will conduct health assessments, including taking their temperature, and they will wear a face mask and be sure to follow social distancing guidelines. The state examiner has laid out some very strict rules for all of us to follow if we enter into a government building. So to summarize on the remote auditing, please be on the lookout for those forms to complete prior to audit. Watch that YouTube video and call us if you have any questions. Again, you'll initially be contacted by phone or email, but it is expected that our field examiners will have regular video discussions with you via Teams or WebEx. Also, requested information should be uploaded into the direct request feature of the annual and monthly upload application. And again, those emails will have very specific instructions for you. So I do hope this gives you a good idea of what you can expect during a remote audit.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. Was there a space for estimated useful life on 2019 capital asset form, and there will be on the 2020 form?
There is a space on the capital asset ledger form 369. Yes. I do not believe that that's going to be asked for on the annual financial report.
And where was the web location for documents prior to audit?
You can find that on our website, www.in.gov/SBOA. And if you go to libraries, down under the presentations and meeting materials, you should find the SBOA YouTube channel, and you'll see it listed there. The title is Forms Prior to Audit. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about internal controls for a few minutes and what that looks like either during and after COVID-19. We have talked about a lot of rules have been relaxed out of necessity during the public health emergency, and we all need to remember that internal controls must change as your environment changes, and we're all in a new environment right now, and we've been through a new environment. But that does not mean that internal controls should be just tossed out the window. A new environment means that internal controls need to be adjusted to meet new circumstances. Now, if you'll notice, the memos and directives of the state examiner that Todd discussed all emphasize policies. And that is an important part of your control environment, and that's what we're going to be looking at when we do an audit. The other key is documentation. Please take some time to write down any new procedures you're using during the public health emergency. That way you can demonstrate that you have put procedures in place to safeguard public funds and prevent or detect errors. And remember, keep documentation that the procedure was actually performed. Now, I realize the people in this picture are not following socially distancing guidelines. But the point of the picture is to show that internal controls is a process that involves people, whether they are together in person or meeting virtually. I have some of the major processes listed here for you. Of course, the bank reconciliation is a control and also a statutory requirement. The receiving and dispersing processes are major areas, and within the dispersing process, there are separate areas such as payroll and credit cards. And lastly, internal controls must be present to provide reasonable assurance that your financial reporting objectives have been achieved. Now, for some areas, the adjustment to internal controls may not be that significant. For example, in the case of a bank reconciliation, an in-person or on-paper review may just be replaced with an electronic review of the documents through email. In many cases, the same procedures can be performed, whether they're in person or electronically. For other areas, for example, the receipting process, social distances or remote work may make the process a little more difficult. What you do now, as far as segregation of duties, may be totally different than it was prior to COVID-19. If it is, just take some time to write down your new procedures. The dispersing process really has not changed, except that final approval from the governing body might be delayed until the public health emergency has been lifted. In order for claims to be paid, either the fiscal officer can pre-approve certain claims for payment based on a board resolution, or a designated board member can pre-approve claims for payment during the public health emergency. At the end of the emergency, the claims must be approved by the governing body. Now, your internal controls should be adjusted for any change to your dispersing procedures. For example, an adjustment to internal controls during this time might be for a designated person to match up the payments through the bank to pre-approved claims. This would detect any unauthorized payments from being made. And that would include unauthorized payments that would be scams that have hit your bank account. In the area of payroll, supervisors still need to certify the timesheet for each employee is accurate. This can be difficult with remote working, so new procedures need to be implemented. Other leaves or pay may have been set up during this time of emergency, and they may need some additional controls. As far as credit cards, COVID-19 may have increased your credit card usage. You now may have more authorized users. Two of the biggest issues we see with credit card usage is custody of the cards and having the required documentation. So does your internal control policy over credit cards need to be adjusted because of new procedures? And we'll talk more about these in the last part of the presentation. Other internal controls surrounding financial reporting might be related to how often you provide financial reports to your board. You know, what are your procedures for keeping the board informed of the financial condition of your library? You know, that will be very important as we encounter the effects of COVID-19. In all of our training on internal controls, we've always told you that the establishment of internal controls is an ongoing process. It is ever-changing based on changing circumstances. And there is a lot to be taken into consideration with COVID-19. Again, because of this, certain rules have been relaxed, but that doesn't mean that internal controls should be disregarded. On the contrary, internal controls should be evaluated and adjusted to meet the objectives of the library during this time of crisis. It is extremely important to make sure that the assets and transactions of the library are safeguarded during this time. And because of remote working conditions, you might find that more review processes need to be implemented. So this really is a perfect time to review internal controls. And as part of that review, you might want to take a look at the best practice documents that we now have on our website. You'll find these on our website at in.gov/SBOA on the library page under the heading of Best Practices. We have best practice documents for the most common areas that we get questions on or that we've had report comments on. The hope is that these best practices will give you something to think about as you either establish internal controls or further develop the ones that you have. We do always try to make it clear that the Board of Accounts cannot tell you what internal controls to put in place. That would jeopardize our auditor independence. But we can provide you information that will help you understand what is needed for a good internal control system. And we hope that these best practice documents, along with the Uniform Internal Control Standards for Political Subdivisions Manual, will help. We have categories available for you to look at in the categories of annual financial report, bank account reconciliation, credit card purchases, dispersing activities, payroll, receipting activities, and the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. And when you go to this there you'll see a long document, for example, the annual financial report, and that is going to take you through each internal control component for that area with a long list of questions for you to think about. And it's also going to have definitions included. The snapshot, you'll also see a second version called snapshot. There are less questions and there are fewer definitions. So take a look at either one of these and see which one would help you the best as you go through and establish your internal controls. Okay, well, sometimes we do get a little bit of pushback on the need for internal controls. And remember that, having a good internal control system is necessary so that your library can meet its reporting, operational, and compliance objectives. Sometimes the lack of internal controls will be reported by our field examiners in a report comment from a compliance perspective. For example, the ledger did not reconcile to the bank. Sometimes the lack of controls can result in a charge to the responsible official, either because the lack of internal controls resulted in a loss to the unit or the official received personal gain. So the purpose of this next section that I have is just to give you more food for thought. The main question to ask yourself is, what can I do to protect my library from this type of an occurrence? Whether we're in the middle of a public health emergency or not, the assets of the library must be safeguarded, and procedures do need to be in place to prevent or detect errors. It's just that those procedures might look a little different in a time of social distance or remote work. Now, during an audit, we'll be reviewing internal controls that are established by your library. In fact, we will ask you, as I said earlier, to fill out that form prior to the audit related to your internal control system, and then we'll test those controls. The most common findings on internal controls that we see are: did not separate incompatible activities related to receipts, disbursements, or payroll, or did not have a review or approval process in place. Did not have a review or approval process over bank reconciliation or the financial close and reporting, or there was no evidence of an oversight, review, or approval process. So it is important that you either segregate duties, and that all that is just having more than one person involved in the process, or if you don't have another person, have a review or approval process in place with somebody outside of the office. And most commonly, we see board members doing those kinds of review processes. I notice that it's not only important for you to have written procedures in place, but it's also important that you have evidence that the procedures did take place. For example, if a board member is supposed to review the bank statement, there should be some evidence that he or she did so, like an initial or maybe a checklist of items that were looked at. Internal controls also plays a role in fraud prevention and detection. As much as we don't really like to think about that, it does happen. Fraud investigations are conducted by a separate division in our agency, and every fraud investigation report I've seen has an internal controls comment in it with at least one of these 3 statements. So if you're still in a situation where you've not separated out your duties, or maybe that's not possible and you've not yet created a review or approval process, we would encourage you to talk to us or talk to your fellow library directors and fiscal officers, and of course Haley at the Library Development Office. We all want success in establishing a good system of internal controls, so please ask about that. Now, what I want to do now is go over some of those major areas where we've had losses or charge reports due to inadequate internal controls, and then I'll throw in a little bit of information on our best practice documents and some changes that might take place during COVID-19. Now, for the receipting process, you'll want to make sure that you have controls in place to make sure that funds are receipted, deposited, and recorded properly. Cash collections that have not been deposited are the subject of many of our charge reports. If cash collections are still taking place during the public health emergency, you'll want to make sure that your controls are adequate to prevent or detect errors in that process. If you're a one or two person office, even if you are a one or two person office, procedures for reconciliation, approval, or verification are very important. Due to COVID-19, you might be receiving more electronic payments now. Maybe your board just authorized electronic payments due to COVID-19. I've included that statutory reference here for you in case your board is interested in authorizing that. If they do, then a process should be created for controls. Due to COVID-19, procedures for the collection of fees may have changed. And really the question is just have you updated your internal control procedures for that. We have also had several special investigation reports involving the overpayment of compensation. Sometimes that is just an error. The hourly wage was incorrectly entered into the system, and a small amount accumulated to a large amount over time. Now, of course, nobody wants to get in that situation because it's very much of a hardship on the person that has to pay it back. In other cases, the overpayment's intentional, and that's really a whole different story. But in either case, controls to monitor and compare the amount of compensation being paid to the amount allowed in the salary schedule should prevent that problem. That comparison should be done by someone outside of the payroll process, and that again is one of the questions that's asked in our best practice documents for payroll activities. So please make sure your internal controls are sufficient to detect any errors in payroll. Errors can occur, especially in these ever-changing conditions. Another area to make sure about is whether your withholdings are reported and paid correctly and on time. Some of us are working outside of our normal setting and things can be forgotten. So it's a good idea to check on that. Because one of the most common types of charge reports we have is penalties and interest. For example, the taxes are not reported and paid on time and the IRS assesses a penalty and interest. You can avoid that by creating procedures to make sure that those payments are made on a timely basis. And if you don't know how to get this started, call us or talk to Haley. A simple checklist might do the trick here. Some units use payroll service providers, which is fine. Just don't forget to put a procedure in place to make sure that the payments they're making are in accordance with the salary schedule and the policies of your library. You are still responsible for the amounts paid to the employees, even though the function has been outsourced. And just a note, a scam has been around for a while now where the scammer will send an email that looks like it came from an employee asking you to change the direct deposit account for that employee. Always, if you get that kind of request, call the employee and confirm that before you do any changes. That just happened to one of our special districts a couple of weeks ago where they went ahead and made that change, and the employee didn't get his paycheck and the district was out some money. So that scam is alive and well, so please be aware of that. Unfortunately, we have a lot of special investigation reports with unauthorized bank transactions. Any unauthorized transaction should be detected through a proper bank reconciliation and review process. But if that reconciliation is not performed or not reviewed by somebody outside of the receiving and dispersing process, unauthorized transactions can continue without notice for quite some time. Some of our common issues are listed here with cash withdrawals or checks payable to cash and counter checks, electronic funds transfers. So I would urge you to make sure that you have supporting documentation for every transaction that flows to the bank. An example that we've had, again, a recent scam, is where a fraudster, for lack of a better word, fraudster will create checks on good quality paper that look like they are the checks of the library. They've got the routing number of the library and it looks like it's from the library, and they'll just write these checks and cash them across the country. We've had some of our units lose quite a bit of money that way. Now, if they notice it on time, if they're reconciling their bank statement, and they notice that unauthorized transaction, then the bank will generally take care of that. But if those reconciliations aren't being done and it goes on too long, then it's more problematic with the bank. So please be sure to reconcile your ledger to the bank balance on a monthly basis. Our best practice document asks questions about reconciling the bank receipts to the ledger receipts and the bank disbursements to the ledger disbursements by someone outside of the receiving and disbursing process. It also asks the question about whether a bank statement is reviewed by management prior to being forwarded to the person in charge of the reconciliation. In other words, is somebody looking at the optical images of checks or the electronic funds transfers for any unusual activity? So these are all great things to keep in mind. It's always a good idea to have someone else review the reconciliation and look over those optical images. Now, your library is more susceptible to unauthorized transactions without a good internal control system. We do have a best practice document on credit cards. Those are a major problem in our special investigation reports with personal purchases, but they don't have to be if you put proper controls on them. So, one question to ask is, how did you handle the authorization process for credit card purchases prior to COVID-19? Did you have a custodian that maintained possession of the card and kept a log every time someone needed to use it? Has that process changed because of COVID-19? Now are you allowing just one person to keep it? Is the number saved somewhere? Those would be things that you really need to think about, and how you can keep track of how your credit card is being used. You might find that you are making more purchases online now. So please make sure that you've adjusted the controls on that card to make sure that only authorized and documented purchases are made. Our best practice document on credit card asks the question, does management assign responsibility or delegate authority to oversee credit card use and ensure the credit card policy is being followed? And does a designated officer or employee compare credit card purchases to an approved credit card policy? And what happens when a credit card policy is not followed? So please take a look at this document when you have a chance. Again, credit cards are a major problem area, but they just need to have proper controls over them. You do want to keep a close eye on all the purchases made, and remember that it's not enough just to have payment based on the credit card statement, like the statement from Discover. You actually have to have supporting documentation for each purchase that's made on the card. Make sure that the security protections for your computer systems are up to date. Also make sure that you maintain confidential passwords for access to your computer systems during this time. Those rules should not be relaxed in order to provide proper security and safeguarding of library assets and transactions. Make sure you back up your computer information and maintain it off-site. We have had some municipalities and counties hit with ransomware. So if your library was hit with a ransomware demand, would you have to pay it, or would you be prepared with off-site storage? We just recently had a municipality contact us about that, where they were hit with ransomware, but they were on top of it. They had everything backed up and off-site, and they didn't have to pay a thing, and they really only missed a very small amount of information from their system. Finally, just be aware of scams. We can never know how many different types of COVID scams there are out there, any other scams for that matter. The fraudsters, they're tricky and they make things look very real. So don't click on any attachments you're not expecting, and always call the sender if you have any doubt. The key through all of this is to take action. Don't let new circumstances leave your internal control policy behind. Make sure you keep at it. Review the internal control manual and the best practice documents. Evaluate your procedures and if they should change due to COVID-19. Make sure that you've addressed all 5 components, and the best practice documents will really help you with this. and then just update your procedures as needed. Now, it could be that internal controls was addressed in the last audit report of your unit. If you're new to the office, you may not know this, so please go back and look at the last audit report for your library. You can find those on our website, again at in.gov/SBOA, and by selecting audit reports right there on the home page. You can type in the name of your library and then search that and read any comments that might be in there. If you do have a comment on internal controls, please address this as soon as possible, or any other comment for that matter. If the comments are not addressed, then in the next audit, it will be a repeat finding, which will require a corrective action plan. You really don't want to have to do that. So if you do look at your prior report and you have questions, please let us know so that we can provide you with some assistance. We would be most happy to do that. Also, we just wanted to remind you that if you become aware of a misappropriation, you do have the responsibility of reporting that to our office in writing. You can send an email to the library's email address, libraries@sboa.in.gov. Also, if you have a material variance or a loss, not a misappropriation, you do still need to notify our office. Again, you can email us at libraries@sboa.in.gov, and that would be sufficient. Oops. We do have a place on our library's page of our website where these instances can be reported. If you go all the way down to the bottom of all the headings on the library's page, you should see one that says responsibilities under 511-127, and you can report that there. Or if you just go to our home page, we now have a little easier place to find right here at that Stop Fraud hand. You can go in there and report a variance or a loss. Then I have our contact information here again for you. We really appreciate you being here today and listening to us. If you have any questions now, let us know, or just go ahead and email us with your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Todd. Do we have any questions? Give it a minute here. Looks like we're mostly thank yous. So again, thank you, Susan and Todd, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. Next up, I'm going to put your afternoon LEU file into the window to download. It'll be up there for about 15 minutes. And Jennifer Clifton, the director of the Library Development Office, is going to fill us in on news from the State Library. Jen?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Haley. And everybody, don't log off yet. I just have a few announcements to make from our office. I wanted to thank Haley for making this workshop happen and Lisa for hosting. When we were planning this workshop back in February, we had no idea it would be entirely online. So our apologies to anyone who wanted to join us in person. We wish we could have seen you today, but hopefully we will soon. Our building is reopening on July 6th, and staff are back working in the building part-time. We are also taking appointments for the public to visit based on our occupancy limits at the time. So if you are interested in visiting, that is an option. And when we got back, we were down one person. Wendy Knapp has moved on and left the State Library after 14 years, and she is now serving as the State Librarian of Ohio. So congratulations to her, but we miss her a lot. So if you had any questions that Wendy could have answered for you, send those our way, and we will try to answer those for you. A couple other things. Info Express is now open for renewal, so you can sign up for your 2020 to 2021 service year. And the service is back up and running. So if you haven't reactivated your account, please do so whenever you're ready. If you need to do fewer days than you had in the past, we can work with you on that to ease you back into service. And then you will also see that a 20% discount has been applied to your subscription for the coming year. And part of this is made possible by the CARES funding that we received from IMLS. That was part of the COVID response from the federal government. We also have additional CARES funding that will be distributed to Indiana libraries, so just keep your eye out for information. I believe Jake Spear will be emailing that to the directors soon. We will be offering direct grants to libraries for COVID relief, and that includes things like purchasing personal protective equipment or PPE, technology, and electronic collection materials. So please watch out for that. We just wanted to give you a reminder that it is okay for your library to extend any plaque cards or non-resident cards issued for the length of your closure, even if you were providing curbside service or any kind of limited service. We want to make sure anyone who paid for a library card is able to get the use out of that. And just like State Board of Accounts said they'll be lenient with some of their audit exceptions this year, we'll also be lenient with some of our standards that we'll be monitoring. So open hours, programs, the weeks of children's reading, and collection expenditures. You won't have to hit those same standards that you may have had in the past this year, because we understand that everyone's in survival mode right now. We just wanted to let you know there's a couple more opportunities coming up for virtual learning. Keep an eye out for our professional development office's schedule of roundtables. Anyone is welcome to participate in any of those. We also have a What's Up Wednesday webinar scheduled for next Wednesday, and that is on preparing for retirement and succession planning. So if any of you are thinking about retiring soon or up for a promotion, you might be interested in that. For LSTA, we know that many of you submitted your applications back in April, and we have been reviewing those, and the funding decisions will be made soon and communicated to you. So I know Angela's been getting a lot of questions about when those will be made, but a lot of that has to do with our own budget. So we'll have that information for you soon. And then finally, if you are a new director who's tuned in, if you did not hear from Haley last week, if you did not get an email from her, please reach out to us, because we are planning this year's new director workshop in August. So that's all I have. Haley.
Thanks so much, Jen. And thank you everyone else for attending today. If you have any further questions, please contact us at the Library Development Office, or contact State Board of Accounts or Department of Local Government Finance if you were tuning in this morning. Any updates, including the archived webinar, will be posted on the State Library's LDO Workshops page as soon as they are available. And I have everyone have a great summer and stay safe.